I have a really fun drawing tutorial for you today with lots of hacks and tips as we go. So be sure to watch all the way to the end as we draw this foggy mountain scene. Hey everybody, I'd love if you'd subscribe and like to support my work. Now let's jump into this. Now as we work through some of these hacks and tips, you might need some unique tools today, so let me show you what I have here. I have some tagboard pieces. I have little pencil shavings that I'll show you how to create in a second. An X-Acto blade, a paintbrush that I don't use for painting. I'm going to use this to apply a really soft layer of lead. I have an electric eraser and a dime that will trace around. And the most unique, I have these pieces of foam from our couch. Now before you go tearing up your couch, a cotton ball might work as a substitute, or makeup sponges. The big thing is you want something that's going to apply smoothly, and you want to make sure there are no oils or anything acidic in your sponge. A traditional blending tool won't work as well because it won't be able to apply as smoothly and easily with the technique that we'll be doing today. Now before we get into the drawing here, there's a little bit of prep work we're going to have to do, but it's going to make the drawing part super easy. We're going to take our pieces of tagboard and we're going to make some stencils in the shape of mountains. So what I'm going to do is just draw in each individual mountain and just loosely draw them on, just get the general shape. Now what I'm going to do is tear these pieces of tagboard roughly along the lines that we drew. I wasn't really close at all there, but you get all these tiny little natural bumps and ridges that really mimic the mountain. So if you were to do this with a scissors or an X-Acto blade, it would be too smooth. Okay, so with our stencils done, let's prep our last item, which is some of our pencil shavings. So this is just a sheet of regular printer paper here. I have my X-Acto blade, and I have a 12B pencil, which is a very dark lead, but a very soft lead. So first thing, you got to shave back some of the pencil. We don't want the wood chunk, right? We just want to get to the lead. So shave off little pieces of the pencil itself. Being careful not to scrape the lead at this point, but if you do, it's not a big deal. We'll call that good for now. Now what we're going to do is just shave off some of this 12B lead. Now the reason I chose a 12B pencil here is because this lead is super soft, so it shaves off really easily. And it's also pretty dark, so depending on the pressure that I apply with my foam blending tool, I can go a little softer or I could go darker. Now as you can see, I already had some prepped here, so we're going to say this is good. If you don't have a 12B pencil, you don't have to go as dark as that. Here I have a 4B. You can see with a 4B pencil, since the lead is a little harder, I have to work harder to get that dust, but use whatever is available to you. Okay, so now, since we have it on this piece of printer paper, just put it into a little jar or whatever you have. Now I can use that to just dip my foam blending tool as I go. And that's all you have to do for the pencil shavings. One thing before we get into the drawing here, I'm going to mark out what in photography they call the rule of thirds. And I'm just doing it roughly here. If you're not familiar, basically that means it's more aesthetically pleasing for the main parts of your image to follow along these different thirds rather than to have things perfectly centered, in particular where these thirds cross. So take your paintbrush and your pencil shavings. Now if you don't have a paintbrush, a cotton ball might work, or basically anything that can apply a really soft dusting. Now before you just go ahead and apply your paintbrush to your paper, have a piece of scratch paper nearby to test it out. So with our law of thirds in mind, I'm going to do just a super light shading of our sky, probably going just below this top third to give it a little bit of a base layer. And that's going to be our sky where there are no mountains. I like to work on a big sheet of paper like this because then as I dip my pencil shavings on the paper, I can kind of use it as almost like an artist palette where I'm getting a sense of how dark things are going to be with my paintbrush, just so I don't go beyond what I want. Now if you don't have a big pad of paper like this, just have a piece of scratch paper nearby. But another reason I like to work on a big sheet of paper like this is because if you frame it, I can cut my paper to the size of the frame and mat. Additionally, if you're working on a project that you're going to get professionally framed, and let's say the bottom of your drawing is really dark, you can then sign your name just below where your drawing ends, and that way the professional framer will mat it so your signature is showing. That's what I do on all of my fine art prints. So that's looking pretty good. Be sure to sweep your pencil shavings into a little pile so they're somewhat in control. And then at the end you can put them back in your little jar or however you're storing them. Now let's get on to the mountains. So let's grab our stencils and just sort of map out how we want to go here. So maybe I'll go this one first. So with the rule of thirds in mind, I want my first foggy mountain ridgeline to be along where that top third is. That will leave everything above that as the sky. So the technique here with your makeup sponge, couch, foam, cotton ball maybe, whatever you got, just give it a test. See how dark you're going to be. One other tip before we do this, you could use something like art tape to hold this down, which will make it a little bit easier. But seeing as most people don't have art tape, I'm going to just do this freehand here. Make sure to hold your stencil down very firmly. So my technique here using the stencil and foam is to make little circles and apply the most pressure as I'm going down and away from the stencil. If you apply pressure up and into the stencil, you risk the graphite getting applied underneath it and wrecking that organic natural edge we created with the tearing. Now as you work your way down away from the stencil, lighten your pressure on the foam or sponge even more until you eventually lift it completely off the paper, leaving some white behind, which will act as the fog behind your next mountain. If you have clean foam or sponges, you can use that similar to an eraser and take some of the graphite off, or you can continue to work some of the blending of your fog. So before you move your stencil, make sure you work it in and you're completely happy. With all this excess pencil shavings, just dust it away. And then we move on to our next stencil. A piece of foam or a makeup sponge works really well for this technique because it can create a soft transition in these foggy layers easily as you vary up the pressure. Unlike a traditional blending tool, as you change the amount of pressure with the foam, it can still expand and contract due to its sponginess and still make contact with the paper, and you quite quickly create a foggy look. So if we back out of this drawing for a second and just think about nature, all of those valleys and lower elevation areas between the mountaintops, that's where there is more humidity and less wind. So that's where the fog settles, and that's what we're trying to recreate here in our drawing. So as we finish the other mountains here, think of all the other applications you could use this technique. You could do a prairie scene. With some practice tearing the edges, you could do a tree-lined hill. Or if you like drawing cityscapes, you could use a scissors or an X-Acto blade in that case and create a more elaborate stencil with straight lines. But with more details like that, I would definitely recommend using art tape to hold your stencil in place as you blend in your fog or hazy scene. You can see at the top of these stencils the great realistic mountain texture we get because we tore the tag board instead of using a scissors. With our mountains done, let's create the sun, which will have hit right on the axis of where two of our rule of thirds lines cross. This makes it more visually appealing than just having the sun centered. To get a decent circle, I'm going to lightly trace around this dime, which is actually slightly smaller than I want my sun to be. But then with my electric eraser, I'm going to erase just beyond my guideline here. Now, remember this is a foggy scene, so this sun wouldn't have this sharp of an outline. So I'm going to take this other pencil eraser I have and just do little circles around the edges to blur the sun's outline a bit, to give it the look of being covered in fog. If you want to add some clouds up here to make things more visually interesting, go for it. You can check out my How to Draw Clouds tutorial for some help. Just make sure they match however your scene is being lit by the sun. And finally, I'm just going to finish off this scene with a line of trees in the distance in silhouette. Because remember, we're facing directly into the sun here. But if you want your trees to be closer up in the foreground and in more detail, you can check out my tutorial on how to draw trees. So there you go. There are some hacks and tips on how to create a foggy landscape. Please subscribe and like to support my work, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.